Hello.
Hello.
I'm Katie Tandy, and this is July Westhale, and we are gathered here today to talk about her incredible new collection of poetry, Via Negativa. And I'm so thrilled to have you on my back deck.
Thank you for
Talk
having
about
me.
poetry in the sun. What a gift. So I was thinking the way we could structure it is maybe bigger questions about craft and how this collection started, and then we could get more granular with some of the language.
Sure.
So I'm always really curious of the origin stories of people's works and how this particular collection began, how you conceived of it, and sort of first iterations.
Great question. So I had finished promoting and going on tour for Trailer Trash, which was my first collection of poetry, and that book is quite personal and autobiographical, and there's a cliche that your first book is always about your childhood.
Interesting. That one definitely is for you. It's so
definitely
beautiful.
Thank you. And this collection came about because there also is a cliche that poets or writers at some point in their lives become very obsessed with writing about writing. So no matter if they're writing about a redwood or they're writing about a shopping mall, they're actually writing about the process of writing. So I grew up devoutly Southern Baptist, and that shows up in my work a lot, even though I'm not a religious person anymore. But I have been very, very interested in this idea of why it is that poets specifically, more than any other type of artist designation, have been delegated as kind of ambassadors of the divine. So this understanding of Via Negativa is a term that's often used in talking about spirituality and religion as a way of describing something by describing what it is not.
Right. I've always loved the Judaic tradition of saying Hashem, right? Which is just the name.
Right.
So interesting.
Or people who don't say the word God, like it's G,
right,
D,
yeah,
or Yahweh, or I grew up very much in a church that had no problem saying God, but there was an emphasis on the abstractness of God's presence. There was not ever a God is this. It was, here are all the things that God is not, so a Via Negativa.
Yeah.
Or a Via Positiva, which is God is everything. God is the trees, and God is this deck, and God is the tomato plants.
Sure.
And
God is definitely the tomato plants.
God is definitely the tomato plants. So this collection dives into the understanding of Via Negativa and Ars Poetica. And Ars Poetica are just poetic manifestos, writers writing about writing, or the poet positioning themselves in a piece that is ultimately about writing. So many of the poems in here are called either Ars Poetica or Via Negativa, with the understanding that at some point the repetition kind of annihilates your distinction between the two.
Interesting. I love that. I'm curious too, which I was like taking some notes about everything in the back, and I'm someone who loves to read poetry and fiction, and you and I have talked about this, and I have no natural skill for creating it. I mean, I think everyone has the terrifying drawer of poems that they wrote in college, but I would venture mine were really terrifying, especially when I think I'm a good writer in lots of other iterations. It's a particularly profoundly blind spot for me in terms of creating with words, but I love consuming it, and I was just sort of thinking about how you conceive of poetry as a vehicle for sensation or feeling or thought. Is it about giving shape to something that's ineffable? Is it about rendering a bodily sensation to be better understood, either by yourself, by the readers? Is it a purge of a vulnerability? Is it an offering? Are there particular ways you thought about these poems serving you and the reader in that way?
I think that it is as expansive as all of that. The reason that I like poetry specifically as a genre is, and not to say that prose can't do this, is that with the economical and surgical form of poetry, meaning that it can be small and contained, or it can be big and expansive. It has the power to enact the experience of something. So it's truly a curatorial art form. There's this Szymborska poem called Identification that I always cite, which is a woman is receiving news that her husband's plane has been shot down in the war. And as you read the poem, the structure starts to disintegrate because this woman is beginning to realize what she is being told. That is enacting form, like through form, is enacting the experience of grief and like the dawning horror of realization.
Right.
So you can do that with form.
Without occupying her bodily self.
Right.
It does a lot of legwork.
And it can bring the reader into that experience to a place of complicity or a place of participation or a place of witness. Whatever the poet wants, they can utilize form in order to enact that content. And it's manipulative. I mean, but it's what drama does too. It's what fiction does. But poetry can utilize it, can do it through white space, enjambment, how if the lines are long, it means they're breathless.
Right.
If the lines are spread out, it means they have lots of breath. So you are taught how to read something by the space and the lines that the poet leaves for you on the page. And that's what I think is powerful about it.
Yeah.
And again, not to say that prose can't do that. Poetry has a longer tradition of doing that.
No, I think that's part of my struggle, perhaps, is it's twofoldedly difficult in that, on one hand, the exactitude of it feels really daunting. And then on the other hand, because you can be as opaque and odd and abstract and poetic as you want to, it's sort of limitless.
Yeah.
And I think the coupling of that somehow is really difficult for me, and why I love or gravitated myself towards memoir, in that all I have to do is render it as truthfully and as beautifully as I can, and somehow, the form of poetry eludes me that way, but I love it.
I think it's similar to the way that people feel about theory. Like Sarah Ahmed in A Feminist Life talks about how, and I had this experience too of being an undergrad and reading theory for the first time and feeling it totally inaccessible to me. Feeling like it was too cerebral, too dense, not made for people who come from like class or education background, for someone else. And then there was a moment of breakthrough when I got it. And I realized that theory, much like poetry, which can sometimes have that hallowed halls feeling, that kind of inaccessibility, that it actually is a form for the people, and it's a form for people who have been marginalized specifically, almost as if it's been codified so that it reaches them. But I'm not going to pretend that it's not.
Yeah, I wonder too, which is interesting to think about, and maybe you know the answer, which is to say like so much of art and life, it has in so many ways been reappropriated by those in power in order to be alienating, right? To exact some sort of control, or to prevent those that you do not want to enter said castle to enter.
Yeah, and the first time I came upon Via Negativa as a concept, not as a practice, because certainly my family was practicing it and my church was practicing it, was in this essay by Ben Lerner called The Hatred of Poetry, wherein he talks about the history of kind of the cyclical love-hate relationship that we culturally have with poetry. And he goes all the way back to Plato and the Republic, and Plato kicking the poets out of the Republic, and this idea of poets always being associated with being dangerous or powerful in some way because of that conduit to the divine, or because of the ability to reach people on an empathy creation level, to get them to be inspired to action. That's why poets are often killed in dictatorships or exiled.
Sure.
So there is this weird history that may or may not be erroneous, right? Like, what power does poetry actually have if we really think about it?
Is it a profound threat, and what does that mean?
Right. And I think that's part of the nebulousness of poetry's identity, and part of the reason why it speaks so well to marginalized folks is because existing in liminal nebulousness is par for the course.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah. something I was thinking a lot about too in reading this collection is the tremendous alchemy it does in terms of like elevating the secular to the sublime, right? And I think these seemingly banal moments, or these moments that you sort of referenced earlier, where like repetition can seemingly wear off all its edges, so you cease to see something anymore, right? And how incredible it is to see something that you know so well again through refracted in such a new way. And I was sort of curious in scaffolding all these different pieces together, because you know they are in dialogue, it is a collection. I was sort of curious to hear some of the seed stories behind some of them, whether they're moments in your life or objects that you were sort of bearing witness to in this new way.
Great question. The collection, I found that when I've been working on poetry specifically, this is not true with fiction or with journalism or nonfiction, but specifically with poetry, I have no idea what a collection is about until I'm about three-quarters of the way through it. So what I thought this collection was about was the decision that people make that seems so alien and bizarre and otherworldly to me, to have babies.
Oh my gosh.
Right?
Yeah.
So,
sure.
and you and I
Cloud
had this
seeding.
conversation. Right. Like,
yeah.
So what is the intellectual versus the physical kind of fight about that?
Yeah.
What do you do if you're a person who has never wanted to have babies, except for like in a maybe philosophical, like, I'm of a certain age and maybe I should think about that. If you're a queer person, if you're a person who was motherless, right? Like, what do these things mean to you? And also, this attempt that I had to talk to everybody I knew who had a kid and ask them probably actually pretty inappropriate questions about their decisions and what their bodies felt like afterwards. And I realized that I was attempting to gather data for a thing that is not quantifiable.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, you make an emotional decision about. And that was sort of, that in and of itself is worth writing many books about. This human tendency to try to quantify something that is not quantifiable. And
it's a compulsion though, right?
Right. But there's emotional resonance there, right?
Yeah.
Like there's a sense-making mechanism that kicks in.
Yeah.
So some of the poems are about that. I ended up sort of annexing a lot of these like baby poems. They're not really baby poems, they're actually weirdly about swans, to a chapbook called Quantifiable Data, or Eccentricities of High Context Animals of a Certain Age is the other term for it.
Yeah.
And then realizing that what I was supremely interested, that had been sort of the trigger, as Richard Hugo says, the trigger to this collection was an attempt to try to solve for an unsolvable X, which is probably something I will be in pursuit of my whole life, I hope.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, the child thing's a doozy.
But there is a poem in there. I tried to give my dead mom a rest for my exhumation of her in this collection.
Yeah.
But she does sneak in there, and there is one poem in particular that I believe, I don't remember if it's called Via Negativa or Ars Poetica, that is about, like, I think there's a line that's something like, I want a baby when it suits me to be utterly wanton and feminine, right? It's like exploring this idea of positing desire when it is suitable. And also when we talk about people socialized as female, we talk about people who want babies, we are talking about people mostly socialized as female.
Yeah.
And then these existential questions that come with it that we don't seem to have a sociocultural framework for talking about, right?
Yeah.
Like, it is not acceptable to be like, I don't know, I'm gonna like philosophize on this idea for a long time.
Yeah.
And probably never come to it.
Yeah.
Elizabeth Gilbert actually talks about this a lot.
Sure.
You know?
There's I forget who wrote it, there's a really beautiful long essay in the New Yorker that talks about these very underpinnings, this very fallacious notion that we all fall prey to, particularly around having a child, whereas wherein we tell ourselves, if I read enough books, like lovingly harangue close people in my life who've made this decision or not made this decision, read poetry, read data, read, that, I will have informed myself of, what I should do, like who I am in, this web of information and mothers and would-be mothers, and but by definition, you cannot know.
And it comes from a place
But
of
it's
wanting
like
to make
holding both those pieces. It creates a tremendous amount of tension, and it's odd that we don't want to just say, "I just want to."
Some people do, and
Right.
they know that.
It is met with joy and ease. That's true. Not everyone is tormented about it.
That's so fascinating and clever to me when it happens, because I don't have a clear ring, a clear bell ringing out, or voice in the night saying, yes, this is the path, my child.
Yeah.
And I think that all of this data collection and this attempt to solve for X, really in this collection isn't so much about having babies, but it is like, what is the relationship between poet and divinity, which I'm categorizing divinity here as like a thing that is larger than oneself, and a kind of ecstasy, as in like the ecstatic poets. So a kind of reverie.
And without ecstasy, you cannot have a child.
Right, but
there's
like
so much in there.
Yeah. So I think it comes from this place of not wanting to make a decision that you will ever regret, which you just simply can't do. You can't do that with babies, like the decision whether or not to have a baby. You can't do that with the decision to be in a relationship, to start a business, to join a religion. Like there is no decision that is free from fallacy, which is kind of amazing.
Yeah.
And that, like living in that space of the attempt to do that or to find that, is what I love most about writing, is the consideration of these kind of unsolved, horrible
things. Yeah.
experiences of being a human in the world who thinks about things. So
cool. Let me hang on. This is you're gonna just be subjected to my mind wanderings. I think my favorite poem, which I read like 5 times, and it gave me fucking goosebumps, is the story about the woman leaving, I guess, her husband.
Oh.
And then, oh my god, I'm so bad.
I think that one's called Via Negativa.
Yeah, it's tricky. Why did you do that? It's hard to find.
I know.
But the last line of it is it's so beautiful and haunting, about blooming 1, 2, 3.
I think it's in the 30s.
In the page 30s?
Yeah.
Sorry.
I know what one you're talking about. When the man from the headline sobbed.
Yeah. Which, I was curious to talk about.
Oh, good, because it's a great story.
Yeah. Start talking about it. I'll try to find it. I'm so sorry.
So, that poem came out of one of, we'll just say for anonymity's sake, it is someone I knew and worked with who killed his 2 children and himself.
Oh my god, I wanted it to be, I don't mean to smile so bigly at that reveal, but Equus is one of my favorite pieces of art ever, and I fucking always loved the backstory of the author reading a story on a train of a child who had blinded an entire stable of horses, and him working backwards as to like what would drive a child to do such a thing, and it haunted him. And so I was wondering if it was a similarly dark seed. Anyway, I'm sorry, please continue.
No, and it was. And I had a mentor in grad school with whom I'm now friends, named Kevin Proofer, who writes a lot about news headlines, and he takes on the persona of people who I find it very daring to take on, like people who have gotten into, like, smashed beer bottles across one another's faces, or, like, Men in War.
Yeah.
And I thought, what would it be like what causes a person to want to, for backstory, for folks who haven't read the poem.
Yes.
The poem is...
Do you want to read it?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Here you go.
Okay. So this one is called Via Negativa, and Katie has circled it and said, murdering children.
Just keeping it clear, tight and high.
Alright. 1. When the man from the headline thought about being a boy, he was a boy. He loved the war, or the dogma of it, like the dappled light of sun across a reference book. To prove himself, he married a woman with history, children. 2 boys who in turn loved war stories, but before he knew them. Once upon a time, they were bantam children with bendable bodies and brains like open atlases. 2. His wife left no note, just her boys, just a poem. Something, 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 season shifting, something, something. He had read so much of her poetry, he knew when burning animals were real and when they weren't. 3. He made a rue the day he killed them, fastening the flowers so it whispered as he whisked. Sun sliced the blinds like smiling clementines, and the skin of onions grinned at the ceiling fan, which said, don't, 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 until he made the older boy flip the switch. He lined them up before the floral wallpaper, the grand jury of botany doing its thing, and like love the gun bloomed 1, 2, 3.
Oh.
So,
Yeah.
but this one's called Via Negativa, right?
Yeah.
So, describing something by describing what it is not. I mean, that poem could very, very, very easily also be called Ars Poetica, and that's sort of the idea.
Man, yeah, there's something so heartbreaking that these children who are not his children are so much his children, so too love violence, so too love the story of dying for something, you believe in, and then, to die by the violence that you've been taught to love, to suffer the humiliation that your mother has rendered on your not father. I mean, it's a really dark story.
I think not to get too big for my britches here, but
Yeah.
I think that it speaks to our masculinity problem.
Oh, yeah,
right?
I mean, I was going to say this, a lot of toxic masculinity.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. There was, I guess, what's also chilling about it too is it feels inevitable, right? Like, if myths play a big role in this collection too, both like self-created and actual. And it feels as though perhaps if he didn't kill them, they would have grown up and killed him instead, right? Which is always like the dark Oedipal fear. Anyway, yeah, I love that. So heartbreaking.
Thank you.
Yeah. Also want to say I love all the animalness. That's like my favorite kind of embodiment. And you do such a good job. I mean, there's so much to talk about. I'm sorry we can't talk about it all. There's so much sexy stuff in here too.
Oh yeah, it's a very erotic collection.
I love this particular line on friendship. There's a really wonderful line where you say, "Fathers never realize the gay they teach their girls how to love a curled lip and snarl, belt a belt, and use it too." And then at the end, which really breaks my heart, you end it with, "The lie of sun in our hair, the lie of youth before we were afraid of the sun." And it is, I think there's so much too about obviously gender and the roles we play and the violence perhaps, or definitely, of being male-born and this sort of the fragility we're forced to take on in no small part because we're supposed to be beautiful forever.
Right.
And that is a huge and dark, strange burden. I don't know. I could keep like going through with my weird notes. I don't know if there's particular pieces you would like to read or talk about, and I'd like to offer that to you. I don't want to dictate,
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I think that to talk a little bit about the eroticism of
please.
the book, because it was one of those things that I didn't realize how much sex was in this collection until I sent it out for blurbs. And my previously mentioned former mentor was one of the people blurbing it, and he says, "Oh, yeah, this is a sexy little collection of books." And I had some strange feelings about that, because in the same way that I think that, you know, you and I have had a lot of conversations as people who run a sexuality publication together about how sometimes sexuality can undermine the seriousness of things, particularly when it comes from feminine people.
Sure.
But the connection between divinity,
right, like calling something a sexy little collection is like pejorative potentially.
Right. I mean, I think he meant it in a really great way, and and I think too that the connection between divinity and a sort of linking to the world around us does come through the body. And there was a fear for me when I wrote this book, a fear that was only assuaged a couple of weeks ago when it came out, or last week when it came out, which is that I was worried that it would be too cerebral and too esoteric, especially in the wake of a collection that was so much about identity and had a delineation towards talking about class that this one doesn't.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is that it's a collection that is wholly embodied in the radicality of what eroticism is or is not, and how it informs the way that we are in the world, right? The very first poem in the book is essentially about a recently ravished speaker. I think that the speaker comes to climax in the middle of the poem, and then goes to the kitchen and just puts their head on a cantaloupe, right? The cool rationale of a cantaloupe. There is something to be said about the connection between Ars Poetica or Poetic Manifesto and the ambassadorial relationship to the divine, and also the bodies that we have been tasked with moving through the world with.
Yeah.
And what it means to utilize those to try to get a greater understanding of things. Because the bodies are used as conduits throughout this collection.
Yeah.
Also, there's always been something really sexy about, like, religion. I mean, and
oh my God, the spirit.
Right.
Yeah, bucking you. Or that famous painting, right? The Ecstasy. Is it St. Teresa? Terrible. I don't know. But she's, like, literally, like, rising in, like, orgasmic, back-arching, blowout pleasure as Jesus enters her.
Right.
Right? I mean, it's a lot.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, there's Teresa, the patron saint of Via Negativa, is another title in this collection too, right? So there is a connection. And then, you know, I was grateful to my publisher because it's not an uncomplicated time to launch a book, and I've been having a lot of thoughtful conversations about how one does that responsibly in the wake of a civil rights crisis, and how as a white presenting person to take up space responsibly. Yeah. And my publisher also reminded me that it is also radical to depict sexuality and embodiedness as queer people, and that is not, I'm not trying to say that to, I think often if folks are marginalized in other identities, there's an attempt to sidestep that they are complicit in a racist system because they are, like, I can't be racist because I'm queer, or I can't be racist because I'm disabled, or whatever. Right. And I'm not attempting to do that. But I think Ross Gay, I've been reading a lot of Ross Gay lately, and his poems are contemporary ecstatic poems through which there is a radicality in joy and delight. And there's a radicality in being in the body. So there's something to be said about that in the conversation as well.
Yeah, totally. I think too, which is different, but and again, maybe we can end it by you reading whatever poem you'd like to, but I was really moved by this poem, Untold Pact. And again, and I apologize, but as such is the nature of the beast, like, once you set something into the world, people glean their own meaning. So
sure, yeah.
forgive me if this is not the meaning, but what I was thinking of in the wake of reading it was that, the pact we make by being born, as you write, right? And it's so true that there are these intricate promises we make just by existing, right? And by definition, we didn't, right, ask for that. And the rhythms we sanction just in being alive, like we're so bound immediately upon being alive. And I had never really thought about it that way, perhaps because it's a disturbing concept to me, maybe.
Yeah.
But it's a really rich one, and I don't know if there's more to say on that, but it's a profound thing to contend with, which obviously dovetails, and I think about this too, but I'd never quite articulated it that way, in birthing something, right? I mean, to birth something, this certainly dovetails with what you're talking about, to bring a Black child into this world. I mean, it's got to be accompanied with some very, very profound fear. And if I have fucking fear in bringing a child into this world, the amount that they are bound by so many systems that I can't protect them from, you know? And that's just one level of the binding, right? So, I don't know. It's heavy, but it's really beautiful.
And I think too that it's complicated for a lot of reasons, and really heavy and multifaceted, because it's not just systems, it's also lineage.
Yeah.
And the sort of lineages of trauma that have been enacted by colonialism and white supremacy, and also the ways in which there's this like culture of gaslighting of like, because the Confederacy isn't quote unquote happening anymore, therefore we have moved past some kind of reductionist understanding of what racism really is. So I think, I mean, there's also this terrifying school of psychological thought, and that, you know, you inherit a lot of shit that your ancestors never worked out, which haunts me all the time, because I'm like,
no thanks.
Yeah, I was also adopted, so I don't have access to all of those lineages, so they feel like these specters that are around me all the time.
Sneaky
of like,
ghosts.
Yeah. But I could end by reading that piece if you
Yeah,
like.
that sounds great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, I haven't read this one yet, ever out loud. Untold Pact. In an aged barn, a born new thing. Sky as old as clocks. Suddenly, everything's shiny or dull. The ice comes like resin, deceptive but not at all. Snow is cheap. The base of her spine like wrung hands, a worn washcloth rinsed and rinsed. The snow falls, leaves like love, and everything sags under the sudden lifted weight. She begins immediately a journey towards a dark place, an open space in the country we think of when we say the country, where asphalt mouths a slobbering mirage, obsidian kissing obsidian. We know nothing more. It please you to remain nameless. It please you that you force me to be cruel. A foal or a kid, a child or a god, unloving. She moans. There's little separation between birth and drunkenness, and the erring therein, indistinguishable. For example, she reached for my breast, as you have. As yours, I expect no less, and push her away. You'd be happy to see the suffering of the world so reflected, an heir of your own mind, to take up the yoke, to be an ass. Sometimes I think of it as prophecy, my young self, haloed in a guest room, the words welcome in foam board above my crown. Half-conscious, dreaming of myself as a fern, sword, lady, checking belly for spores, and finding none. Waking sticky, startling from an image, myself in a vase on a mantle. Flowers don't matter. It's winter. I've cut and buried parts of myself that loved plants that bloom then die immediately. I don't need encouragement. This is the pact we make by being born, that you go on and I go to waste. For years I thought it akin to some specific land, and anything could summon it. But now it is a muted pastel, a part of everything. It no longer startles.
So beautiful.
Thank you.
I'm so happy that I got to talk to you about this, and I could ask 1,000 more questions. I likely will in the future. But where can people find your work and support you?
So I have a website, julywesthale.com, and also Core, my publisher, which is Kore, is the best place to buy it because one, I get royalties, and two, they're also donating the proceeds of their sales to a Black Lives Matter organization in local Tucson where they're based. So
Great.
if you buy through them, then you support me, and you also support them, and you also support Black
Powerful
Lives Matter.
trifecta.
So,
Yeah. Do it. Well, I'm super proud of you. Not that you need my accolades, but proud to know you, and it's a beautiful collection.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. Bye for now.